to ensure that voices are heard in relationship to the new accelerated relations between the United States and Africa. The basic premise of my presentation, which my sisters asked me to focus on, what you call liberatory conceptual basis for the relations between the United States and Africa. And I want to start from the premise that there can be no peace in the relationship between the government of the United States of America and the peoples of Africa until there is an acknowledgement of the crimes of the past and how the institutions and culture of the United States, the dominant one, are built on the hierarchy of human beings. The debasement of black people and black life, the continued warfare against Africans, and this requires reparative justice. And we must start from the concept of reparations, and that one cannot discuss peace without reparations. That's the basic premise. And that this week, we have not heard this discussion about reparations and reparative justice. For some people, reparations means money. But in my presentation today, the money is not the central question because Africa is too rich. What is important is how do we reframe the ideation plane of what constitutes Africa and what constitutes black life, so that if there's anything we can do in our work is that we recognize this pathology in the intellectual and cultural discourse in the United States about Africa, and that we do not, even when we say we're doing advocacy, reinforce and deepen that pathology, because we draw from the wellspring of that intellectual culture in the United States that diminishes black life and reproduces a hierarchy of human beings. That's the basic premise of where I'm starting from. Because there is a contradiction in the conception of peace and security from the point of view of the United States of America and its dominant powers and those of Africans, whether they're in Africa or the United or wherever they are. And intellectually, those who are from the United States Military Strategic Association, and the Military Strategic Association involves all those who are what I call in this presentation the web of militarism. Because the web of militarism includes intelligence, surveillance, private contractors, and especially the international NGOs who are now in the Office of Transition Initiatives. Because many of the work that is being done about United States and Africa really is taking people away from the most important subversive work which is being done through international NGOs on the ground through this thing called the Office of Transition Initiatives. So we have to see how we deal with peace and who are the liberatory theoreticians and people we can draw from. I have mentioned 4 in this paper. 1, W. Du Bois. 2, Martin Luther King. 3, Malcolm X and Wangari Maathai. And these 4, I think, provide in their life and their work interconnections between peace, justice, anti-racism, and environment. And we cannot separate any of these. As Du Bois said in World War I, how is it we can talk about peace and cutting down on military spending without dealing with the questions of racism in international politics? That the number 1 cause of war that he was speaking about in World War I was the racism of the international system. So where we need to go is that in the United States of America, they want to be very selective about the United Nations instruments that they draw from. They will draw from the United Nations on responsibility to protect when it suits them. But they will not draw from the United Nations when it comes to the United Nations Commission on Human Security. We do not have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to human security. The United Nations had a very clear commission on human security and laid out very precisely the terms, especially the 6 main terms of economic security, health, well-being of people, citizenship, and so forth. And so we cannot talk about human security just as though we cannot go on human security without going back to the United Nations document on the World Conference Against Racism and the program of action. And those who are dealing with peace refuse to go to the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, because World Conference Against Racism says the whole educational system in the United States will have to be changed. So we want to be doing this, and Obama is bringing people to the United States under the Young African Leadership Summit. And the Young African Leadership Summit is fed into an intellectual institutions, an intellectual and cultural framework, which if we read this book, Ebony and Ivy, which has its foundation in racism, has its foundation in the hierarchy of human beings. So you bring people intellectually to feed them, to say you are inferior and you have to catch up to the United States in terms of the hierarchy of human beings. And so we have to be able to say, how is it we are going to use this opportunity to deepen our attempt to reframe the issues. And this is clear in the way in which there's been a strategic effort to diminish any kind of continuity between the work that was done in the anti-apartheid forces in the community and in the university. And what a travesty for President Obama to name the Young African Leadership into the Mandela Rally. It's a travesty because it does not follow the Mandela principles of inclusion and how to transform human life. And this diminution can be seen in the way in which all of the resources are going to those, what they call NGOs, who are fed into the Office of Transition Initiative. I'm focusing on this because this is even more important than Africa. Because OTI is dealing with what they call defense, diplomacy, and development. And we can see enough projects and the kind of resources Podesta in that project have in relationship to what has happened to TransAfrica. TransAfrica was an organization that dealt with the community, the university, and in Africa, the Caribbean, and globally. And what we have seen that has happened to that is just one manifestation. As was said earlier in the plenary this morning, that the conception of peace and security in the United States intellectually goes back to the Hobbesian state of war and the Kantian principles about hierarchy of human beings. And we can see in Libya that when people talked about this meeting today, and I'm glad Maurice raised the question about the destruction of Libya, under the name and the guise of bringing humanitarian protection. I have a book here, which I have some copies of, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, about how the United States has destroyed Libya along with NATO. We in the peace and justice movement, we cannot have meetings without discussing this. And all societies that suffer from genocide and destruction cannot then go out and carry out genocide and destruction. We see that in the case of Israel, where the Israelis are now carrying out crimes against the people of Palestine, when they themselves have suffered. So the intellectual and ideological framework that we start from will be very important. So in the United States of America, the militarization of our communities come from the same mindset about law and order that comes from the Hobbesian concept of peace. For me, the choking of Eric Garner in New York is a metaphor about the United States' relationship with Africa. Eric Garner was choked to death. He said, "I cannot breathe." That's Africa. Africa cannot breathe. Africa is being choked to death. And the choking to death of Eric Garner, we cannot speak about peace and security in Africa without speaking about Trayvon Martin. And the fact that the police in the United States believe that to keep law and order, you can dispense with African life. It is the same mindset that goes into Africa in dispensing with African life. And so what is happening is in the United States Africa Command, it is not the drones, and don't fool yourself. The United States having 5,000 troops in Africa cannot mean the militarization of Africa, because there are 1 billion Africans. And 5,000 troops in Africa does not equal to the 80,000 troops that the United States have in Europe. What is more important is how the United States Africa Command has established the Social Science Research Council in Stuttgart. So most of the research which is done on Africa has to come through the United States military and security apparatus, which includes all of those private equity groups such as Booz Allen, which comes out of the Carlyle Group, that is going to set up capital equity fronts for the defense contractors in Africa. We in the left and progressive movements, we should not be going by fads from the Washington Post about drones. Yes, Africans will defeat any amount of drones in Africa. Information warfare, surveillance, and the collection of information is far more important than in what they're doing on the ground in Africa. So the United States Africa Command, we from the progressive movement, we have delegitimized the US Africa Command to the point that Obama himself does not mention the United States Africa Command. We must continue this work of delegitimizing it, but we must also delegitimize those fronts like Creative Associates and those NGOs. There are 8 of them, and you can read my article on the Office of Transition Initiatives about how to go forward. Malcolm X said, "You cannot know what's going on in Mississippi unless you know what's going on in the Congo." Malcolm X made that link. Obama, in his book Dreams for My Fathers, talked about how he was influenced by Malcolm X. He was not influenced enough so that his Department of Education can take away the resources that are now going to the Pentagon into the Department of Education, so that Yali is not taking resources away from Fulbright, away from real research, so that there's real resources going to Africa. Let me conclude by saying that we are at a process of transformation. We are at the point of transforming human society. And Africa is at the forefront of the transformation of African society. Repair means that we have truth. Mandela, which we spoke about, came with a philosophy of Ubuntu. What is the truth about Ebola? Where did Ebola come from? One of the requirements of truth and new relations with Africa is that we should not hide anything. We now have the information about the Central Intelligence Agency and the killing of Patrice Lumumba. Ebola was not known in Africa before. What kind of experimentation has gone on? Just as the experimentation with Project Coast. So when we talk about United States military in Africa, we need to also examine biological and chemical warfare and the experiences of biological and chemical warfare as they fit into what is called medical apartheid. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Martin Luther King and Wangari Maathai, Martin Luther King and Du Bois, they all had a conception of peace that validated human life. Let me conclude by quoting Martin Luther King. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We need rapidly to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. A nation that continues year after year to spread more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. We in the peace and justice movement will be part of the brain-dead robots if we follow the intellectual culture of the university infrastructure that keeps out Africans and African ideas. The dealing with Africa is not about a cause. Africa has human beings, and the tradition of humanity in Africa means that everything we do must rise with the the rising force in Africa to reconstruct Africa in the 21st century as a space for human beings. And that we can do if we go back to the traditions of those who've gone on before us.
Okay, thank you, Horace. That was a great overview of Africa and also the Thank you.